Okay, there we go. All right, good morning. My name's Jen Barborak, and I'm the Executive Director at the Buhl Regional Health Foundation. I'm a registered nurse, and I also have a bachelor's in environmental science and a master's in grant writing, grant management, and nonprofit program evaluation. But I'm here to tell you that that master's doesn't really mean that much when it comes to grant writing. The important thing that qualifies someone to be a grant writer is experience. And I have about 24, 25 years of experience in grant writing. Most of the grants that I have written have been for environmental reasons, parks and rec, and social service grants. So I do have a little bit of experience with PA state and local grants. I've helped with federal grants through the city, through fire departments, and also some environmental federal grants, but that is certainly not my forte. My forte is foundation grants. And so that is largely what this class will touch on is, or we'll talk about is foundation grants. We will touch on state, federal, local a little bit, but if you're looking for federal, I'm not your gal. So currently as the executive director, I've served a new role in that, and now I'm reviewing grants. And so as a grant writer, I had a lot of experience in what I thought was important to put in grants. But now over the last almost 2 years, I also have the experience of reading what people put in grants and kind of looking at that and saying, oh, maybe this should be taught a little bit of a different way. So I'm also bringing that experience to you as well. So I have a whole new perspective on it, and I want to pass that perspective on to you so that you can write excellent grants. And the key takeaway, like I said, college degree doesn't mean anything. It's experience that really counts. So if we can put this, I know Jess is working to put the slides up, make sure that everybody can see them. And then we'll go to the second page. So a little overview about what we'll talk about over the course of the first 3 classes. Hoping to get all of this done in 3 classes, and if not, we'll carry over into the 4th class. But the 4th class, I'd really like to save for a lot of Q&A and individuals who are more interested in writing grant applications to the Buhl Regional Health Foundation. So we'll talk about grant seeking, and that's the majority of what we'll talk about today is kind of the basics of how you find the grants, what you need to know in order to look for the grants. And then after that, we'll get into some of the pieces of the grant. We'll go into the letter of inquiry, the cover letter, executive summary, all that good stuff that you can see on this slide. And by the way, the slides will be emailed to you, so you'll have copies of all the slides. Don't think that you have to struggle writing everything down real fast. Then we'll talk about how to pull everything together. We will spend a lot of time on the budget. We'll spend time on goals and objectives and evaluation, because that's very important. And then we'll talk about after the proposal, how do you handle rejection? Or if you got the grant, then what do you do and how to sustain the relationship with the funder? So we'll go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about what grant writing is. Grant writing is an award of money that allows you as your organization to do a very specific program or project. And with the grant, you have to meet specific guidelines according to the funder. And then you have to spell out those guidelines really in painstaking detail. Then you have to report on how well you were able to accomplish what you set out to do. So that's a grant in a nutshell. What is grant writing? It's telling a story. That is plain and simple what grant writing is. It is marketing your organization to a funder. It's connecting you with the organization or the funder and really endearing that funder to your project and your program. It's forming partnerships. with funders. It's not simply writing. And the biggest myth is that grant writing's hard, and I hear it all the time. Oh my, you were a grant writer. Oh, that's hard. That's difficult to do. And the truth is, people tend to confuse something that is difficult with something that's time consuming. And I always tell everyone, grant writing is not hard. It's time consuming. It takes a lot of your time relative to looking at the finished product, which may only be 5 or 6 pages long. But that 5 or 6 pages might take you 6 months to a year to pull together. Just like anything else, you have to practice at it and you have to be very patient at it. So it takes a lot of patience, but also wordsmithing and using proper techniques and mechanics, very, very good grammar. And if you're passionate about the program, writing that proposal is going to be so much easier. So if you're fully knowledgeable about what you're writing about, you know it like the back of your hand, then writing that grant is even less of an undertaking. The next myth is that grants are something for nothing. They're big chunks of free money, like winning a lottery ticket. They're just money to fortify your budget. And that is the farthest thing from the truth as possible. No funder is going to give their resources to you to simply fortify your budget. Grants are to fund good ideas that lack the funding to develop them. And always keep that in mind, but also keep in mind that your good ideas have to be outlined, researched, and developed prior to writing the grant. And data needs to be collected to support the need of the grant within the community. And then that idea has to be written in a way that's compelling, convincing, with an excellent presentation wrapped with a beautiful bow, and stated in a way that's going to attract the attention of the donor. All right, so the next myth is that grants are only awarded to organizations that have the greatest need, and that you need to know somebody at the funder's location. And the truth is that grants are awarded to those who have the ability to match the project to the donor's interest and deliver the application in a compelling way. Funders want to see applications that have a strong and credible leadership, a demonstrated ability to get the job done, and the commitment to see the project through. So you have to parallel your goals with the donor's mission and goals. And I'm gonna say that until I'm blue in the face throughout this. That is probably one of the most important things to remember, is that when you're looking at a possible funder's website or their grant guidelines, you need to make sure that their mission matches your program, and not that you're developing a program to match their mission. There's a big difference there. And then building your relationship. And then the next myth is that to win grants, you have to apply for as many as possible. And I'm going to tell you, when I started out as a grant writer, I tried this, the shotgun approach or the spray and pray approach, where you take one grant application and you just mail it to everybody. And that is just like totally the wrong thing to do. And I'm telling you that from experience. You have to involve everyone in that grant application to help you to streamline the application for what the funder is looking for. So don't just write a boilerplate grant, send it to as many funders as you can, because all it's going to get you is multiple failures, and then you're going to become disillusioned with the whole grant process. Instead, spend the time, and we're going to talk a lot about grant seeking, where to find the grants. Find 3 to 5 funders, start with them, and make sure that their mission and vision match what your project is, and then be sure that you're answering their questions, specifically the way they are telling you to answer their questions, with the most, the highest quality work that you're capable of producing. So winning grants depends on pinpointing the matches between you and your funder and tailoring the proposal to that. Proposal writing, as I said, it's a team effort, and it should involve anyone that's participating in the project. And that means volunteers who might be completing the work, to the person who puts together your budget, and everyone in between. If you have one big group meeting and you say, okay, here's the grant that we're applying for, here's the funder, here's what their mission is, here's how we feel we match. What do you think? A lot of times, don't discount your volunteers. A lot of times your volunteers will say, oh, wow, this part of this project, which is something that they do all the time, but you don't really know that much about, oh, that fits in perfect with this. And volunteers, in my mind, oftentimes provide the most input into your project and how to develop the project. And a good proposal is not just put together in a few weeks. Some grants might take a month or more to write, and depending on the stage that your project is in, might take a year to write. So if you're not in a good place with your project or your program, don't write the grant. It's best for you to wait until the next round and then submit it when you have everything that you need at your fingertips. So before you start writing the grants, you have to find the funders. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm going to go over briefly who the funders are, the different types of funders that you might be applying to. And this is very important to know because you don't want to apply to the wrong type of funder for a project. So here we see several types of funders. The first is foundations, and there's several different types of foundations. Family foundations have a very narrowly focused giving pattern, and it's based on the intent of the donor, the family member who made the donation, or sometimes the interests of the current family member. And that's something to keep in mind because there were several times when I was writing grants where I would go to a family foundation's website, and they had specific guidelines, and I would do all my documentation, everything. And I'll show you later on, save everything so that you know who you've gone to and what websites you've looked at. And then I might go back 5 years later and look at that same website. The family members who are in control of the money have now shifted. That older family members have either passed away or have passed the goal, the management on to younger family members. And so when that's the case, their whole focus might shift. And they're allowed to do that because it's family run. And so it's important to remember that just because one family foundation might not support something now, doesn't mean that you can't go back in 3 to 5 years or even each year, look at their website and see if there's been any changes. Foundation grants are usually a smaller amount that you're receiving as compared to federal grants, where you can get a huge chunk of money through federal grants. Foundation grants are not quite as big. They can range, from $1,000 for a project all the way up to, a couple $100,000. Rarely would you find, the smaller family foundations or foundations in general giving $1 million, $1 million grant in a year. That would be much larger foundations. Independent private foundations, which is what Buhl Regional Health Foundation is, are different from a family foundation. A family foundation usually doesn't have a staff. Usually it's the family members as volunteers coming together to kind of determine where the funding focus is. Occasionally they'll pay one of the family members to kind of oversee the process, but independent private foundations usually do have at the very least a small staff. And the funds are almost always from a single source. I've learned to never say always, but such as an original donor, like our funding for Buhl Regional Health Foundation came from a hospital, the cell of a hospital. So that original donor or that group of individuals who made that initial donation, that is what that foundation has to fund, is whatever those individuals kind of came up with when they started the foundation. They're managed by a board. The staff and the board are ethically and legally, and I am telling you legally, bound to follow the donor's intent. Okay, so it's not like a family foundation where you got a family member that says, I think we want to go into environment for a little pot of this money. This is not the case with these private foundations. They go through court hearings. They are bound by law to follow the regulations that have been set forth to them. And depending on how broad their focus is, they might find some creative and collaborative projects that are eligible for their funding. But for the most part, it's a very narrow focus. Private foundations are also bound by law to spend a minimum of 5% of the market value of their assets every year on charitable causes that meet their mission. This is important for you to know. For this reason, first of all, they don't usually fundraise or seek public financial support. But we'll talk about what the importance of knowing, that 5% rule in a little bit. Then we have federated funds, and federated funds are created to benefit the community by pooling donations from individuals and businesses. And then they use those funds to support nonprofit organizations. And usually those nonprofits are predetermined by the group of people that have donated to them. The United Way is an example of a federated fund. And then there's corporate foundations that are company-sponsored foundations, and they usually tie their giving to something related to their corporate goals. So for example, a drug company that funds medical research. Community foundations are set up all over the country. Every state in our country has a community foundation, at least one. Many states have multiple. Our community foundation is in downtown Sharon, and it's the Community Foundation of Northeast Ohio and Western PA. They're set up to administer individual trust funds or pools of funds from individual donors who want to benefit their own city or region, but don't want to create a new foundation. And so then the income from those invested funds as a group is used to make grants. And many of those funds have their own little processes for which people can apply to funding for them. But usually there's a grant administrator within a community foundation who has his or her finger on the pulse of just about every fund within that community foundation. And so if you go to that particular person, ours at the community foundation is Judy Redkowski. She can pretty much talk you through, okay, what funds might be interested in your project. And then financial institutes also have charitable trusts that are set up for specific donors within their institution. They do receive proposals very much in the same way as other foundations do, but you have to usually know or have an in to get in with them. And then businesses oftentimes will fulfill their civic responsibility through sponsorships and sometimes grants. Businesses are a very good place for small organizations or organizations that are just getting started to seek funds from. Find businesses that support different things that your organization is working with, and then establish a relationship with them. Federal grants are made to accomplish a public purpose, and their funding purposes and conditions are spelled out usually in legislation. Very few have a small number of restrictions. Most of them have significant limitations, very specific reporting requirements. But I can tell you, if you take the time to find these types of grants and submit them, they can offer a substantial and stable multi-year funding pattern for you. They're just extremely hard to get because a lot of times you're competing against organizations from all over the country. So right now there's about 2,000 federal assistance programs in our country through over 25 grant-making agencies, and there's over 1,000 grant programs through those assistance programs. Federal grants almost always require collaboration and partnerships. And there's multiple questions that you're going to answer related to an organization's capacity and evidence-based practices. State grants are easier to get than federal grants. Obviously, you're up against a smaller pool of organizations. The preparation for a state grant is less complicated. They are time consuming though. And then there's local grants. Oftentimes our county agencies have grants for specific programming. So call out to the courthouse. Usually the county grants are social service related. So if you're in a social service organization, the county may be a good place to start. And they include community development block grants, workforce development grants, community action partnerships sometimes have the ability to make grants. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about, we'll start to talk about grant seeking. And grant seeking is as much about knowing what to do and who to work with as it is about how to write. And it happens year round. It should not, and this is very important, it should not only be happening when you need funding. You should not need funding and then go out and try to find the grant for you. You have to be aware of the funders in your community and what they fund at any given time. Grant seeking requires a lot of preparation. And for a long time, I had a hard time making my bosses understand this. You can't just sit down and Google and find foundations that are going to fund you. It's extremely time consuming. And like I said, it's about building relationships. Grant seeking is also very annoying. Sometimes you're going to connect with 5 or 6 different funders before you find the right one for your project. And sometimes it can take up to a year of connections with a funder before you can even determine whether or not they're the right fit. So it's like trying to make your way through this maze and you finally think you're at the end, but then you hit another part of the maze. There's a lot of organizations out there that are seeking funding. So keep that in mind when you're working with these funders. You have to be ready to submit when it's time on their end. And that means knowing your organization and your project like the back of your hand before you even start reaching out to the funders. Keep in mind that even when you do find a funder that aligns with your project, you might not get the full amount the first time. You might not get anything the first time. So what happens at that point? Then you have to decide whether you can continue without the funding or you can continue with less. Or do you have to try and raise additional funds? So if a funder comes to you and says, look, we can fund 50% and you can't continue with 50%, you have to be honest with the funder and let them know that you'll come back to them when you have, the additional funds. So on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about understanding this grant seeking cycle and what you need to know before you start looking for the grants. And first is to learn all about your organization. You have to know the needs of the organization and the community and the needs of the community. And you oftentimes need to support that with data because your funder is going to want to see that you've done your homework. It's impossible to write a grant for a project unless you know your own organization, or if you're a consultant, you have to know that organization plus the project, okay? You can't just have a project that you're going to write a grant for and think that you're going to be able to find the funders for it. You also have to know how that project fits into that organization's mission, vision, and goals. So the leading question is, as an organization, who am I? And where do you fit in to these different types of organizations in general? And I'm just briefly going to touch on them. Are you a grassroots organization? Grassroots organizations are smaller, they're localized, they have minimal staff, sometimes just one person, and they're volunteer driven. They're heavy on the volunteer side. And they can be successful raising a couple $100s through fundraisers of dues and sometimes thousands of dollars through fundraisers. But the biggest mistake a grassroots organization makes is that they start to seek grant funding before they're ready. They're so excited and driven by their mission and what they're doing that they forget to have all their ducks in a row before they go out and look for a funder. There's social service agencies and other nonprofit service providers. Maybe you fall into that category. And those are set up to address the needs of people, daycares for children, maybe daycares for elderly, employment readiness, housing. They can be just an agency, a government agency, a nonprofit organization. They might even be run by churches. Now, those two organizations can oftentimes receive what's called nonprofit status from the federal government. And to receive nonprofit status, they have to become incorporated first through their state, and then they apply for and receive tax exempt status through the IRS. And this is important for you to know, because then when you receive your federal designation as a 501c3 organization, you'll hear that thrown around a lot. And 501c3 refers to the section of the IRS that authorizes nonprofit organizations. When you learn that you received that status, you will get a determination letter in the mail. That is a document from the IRS that states that you're tax exempt. Funders will ask for this. They will require this, and they want it attached to your application. So it's important for you to know and understand what the letter is. And I can tell you, as a reviewer of grants, people don't know what this letter is. So make sure when you are back at your organization that you find that letter and you have it with you. It's very important to have it. Once you know and understand your organization's nonprofit status, now you need to get into the meat of the organization and learning, what is your mission? Can you, as the grant writer, clearly articulate the mission and the vision? A lot of people can't. Make sure that you have your elevator pitch. Is the mission well established? And then who leads the organization and what experience do they have? Do they have credibility in the community? And then the next thing for you to know is whether or not the board is actively engaged in the organization. Your funder will want to know this. Does your board represent your constituency? So for instance, when I was writing grants for the medical equipment recycling program, we had a person on it wasn't the board, but it was on the committee who, number one, was a provider of medical equipment. So we had that kind of aspect, but we also had a person on our board who had used the medical equipment for family members, for herself. So it's important that your board looks like and matches the people that you serve. And a lot of funders will ask that. You have a solid financial background. And with that, can you convince a funder that you're going to be a good steward of their funds? And then what's your staffing situation? Funders will look at this. Do you have adequate staff to not only administer the program, but to administer the grant and get the data and the reporting collected and finished? And then think about what your organization does, and then think about what does your organization do best? What impact do you have on the community? Do you know and understand your impact clearly enough to describe it? And I can tell you, many grant writers and organizations do not. They cannot clearly describe what the impact will be on the community. And then another very important thing is collaboration with other organizations. So when you get back to your office, think about what we just went through and write down your mission and vision. Write down a strength of your organization, but then think about why that is a strength. What data do you have to support that is a strength? And then start to think about what are the needs of your organization, and maybe write down 2 or 3 of those needs. And then just jot down who your leadership is, and not just who your executive director is, but who do you call on for specific problems? When you're looking for maybe budget information, who is the leader related to the budget? Who's the leader related to the program? And you need to know those things like the back of your hand. And then what are you seeking funding for? Is it program support? Is it capital support? Is it operations support? Is it education, conferences, training, research, publication? Know specifically what you're seeking the funding for, because after reviewing a lot of grants, I can tell you a lot of people don't understand what they're seeking funding for either. Then the next thing on our list here is to match. Step 2, match your organization's program needs with the funder's giving patterns. And I told you, you're going to hear me say this over and over again, but that's because it's very important. So when you're looking at those needs that you wrote down, which one of those needs is the funder going to find most interesting? And then does the available funding and the timeline for funding match what your organization's needs are related to the timeline and the availability of funding? And then is the grant amount going to meet your total need, or will you have other support coming in as well? So I'm going to share a form that I always found useful, and it's called the prospect worksheet. Everybody will get this by email. Jess, are you able to bring it up? Or I don't want to mess up a good thing. if you can't bring it up, don't worry about it. But everybody will get it by email. Let's see if we can bring it up here. Can everybody see it on Zoom? If we could get a couple thumbs up that you can see the worksheet. No. Okay, I'll just go through it with you and then you'll get it by email. But what the worksheet is it's simply the basic information that you're going to collect from your funder. And it's literally name, address, contact person. And then the financial data, which I'm going to teach you where to find the financial data related to your funder coming up next. How much they've paid in grants, what are the grant ranges, and then the period of funding. And then there's a little wee section that says, is the funder a good match? And it asks for you to list a couple of your focus areas. And then it asks you to match that to the funder's focus areas. And then other information such as geographic limits, types of support, officers, trustees that might be people that you know. And then down at the bottom, it asks you, for to put the deadline of the funder, what is the guidelines, the application process. And what I used to do when I was grant seeking for multiple programs is I would make copies, literal paper copies of this on different colors. And so if I was looking for, grants related to the medical equipment recycling program, those might all be pink. And if I was looking for grants to fund an AED program, those would all be blue. And so then you can kind of, as you start to collect these grant prospects and you have them organized in a certain way, you can then, when you find you have a need, you already have at your fingertips. Oh, this is a need, we now need some funding for that AED program. I know to scan through the blue ones. So it's just a little tip from me. Set it up the way you want to set it up. I mean, a lot of people don't even, I don't even use paper anymore. As a grant writer, I'm not sure how I would go through not using paper, but set it up the way that makes the most sense to you. But I'm telling you right now, it's extremely important to get yourself organized before you start in the whole process. Because if you're disorganized at the beginning, you're going to be totally clueless by the time you get halfway through, or if you get multiple funders. The next thing is to invite the funder. I don't know if we can go back to that slide. Invite the funder to invest in your organization. Make sure that you keep that in mind. Your funder is investing in you. So when you're making that initial phone call to a funder, you're not asking them for money. You're asking them for a partnership. When you make that phone call or that initial email or that face-to-face meeting, make sure that you have fully researched them and that you know everything that you need to know about your program. And having that worksheet in front of you, having your information about your organization next to you. Back in the day where you used to have like phones that you actually had to pick up and dial the number. And I remember like the first few times I was trying to call a funder, I would get to that last number and I would hang up. I'm like, no, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. Make sure that you're ready because the funder will ask you questions. And if you're gaining ground with the funder and then you have to say, oh, gee, you know what? I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to have to get back to you. That kind of backs you up a couple steps in their mind. You should pretty much be able to answer most questions about your organization and your program to a funder. So make sure you're ready when you make that call. And then follow up is essential. Keep the people in your organization informed and keep the funder informed. When you send a grant application, it's important to keep your board informed. For many reasons. You might have board members that have connections with that funder. And if you keep them informed and say, hey, look, this is the project that we submitted a grant to X Foundation for. And one of those board members might be out in the community and run into a friend of theirs who is with that funder and say, hey, you know what, this is a great program. It happens all the time behind the scenes. It's not illegal for it to happen either. Your board members are there to support your organization and your programs and to push those programs and ideas out in the community. But then, making sure that you follow up with the funder. I wrote a grant one time to an organization in Washington, D.C. for a little local organization and got nothing. And all of a sudden, 6 months later, I got a check in the mail for $10,000. And I'm like, whoa, what's this for? So then I called the funder. And here I found out that when I had submitted, this was when I was very new in grant writing, when I had submitted the application, it had been just after their round of funding closed. And so they took my application and put it aside for the next round of funding. Now, had I been smart, after I sent that letter or, that little letter of inquiry with my little bit of application in it, I would have called the funder maybe 3 weeks later and said, hey, I submitted this to you, just making sure you got it. And they would have said to me, oh, yes, we got it, but it was after the application closed. We're saving it for our next round. So don't underestimate the importance of the follow-up. The follow-up is extremely important. And then evaluate how you can improve your process. Making sure, did you get invited to submit a grant from that LOI or from that phone call? Did you not get invited? Is there something that you can do differently to maybe get invited next time? The next useful sheet, that I found useful, was a grant proposal checklist. And make sure that you get this in email too. But this is useful for once you've made a contact. And it just simply has the foundation funder's name, who the contact person was, who you talked to, what date you talked to them, if there was any board connections, and then what program or project did you talk to them about? And then, deadlines, thank you letters sent. It's very important to send a thank you letter. Please don't forget to thank your funders. Even if you didn't get funded, it's important to thank them for the time that they took to review your application. Did you make a follow-up phone call? And then on this sheet that I'm going to send to you is 3 questions to ask your potential funder. One, if you were declined, is there anything we could have done differently in our proposal? Ask it, because many times when I asked that question, I got a lot of really good feedback. And then the second is, can we submit for your next round of funding? If you get a yes, then you know that you can submit. If you get a no, then follow up with is there anything that we could change that might make us qualify for funding? Don't change your program just to meet the guidelines of the funder, though. But if there are little things that you could change, without changing your program, then it's well worth doing. And then the third question is, are you aware of any other foundations who we might approach? And that is very important. And I can't tell you how many times I've had funders tell me no, but they've said, hey, but try this foundation or this foundation. They know them and they'll connect you, or at the very least, they'll tell you who you could go to. And then at the bottom of this form, it's just a little bit of information about the financial aspects if you get an amount awarded. And then what I used to do with this checklist is keep it with my grant application for that particular funder. So earlier I mentioned that grant seeking is a year-round process, and that's because each of these steps are very time-consuming, as you can imagine. In the early stages of grant writing, then, the time is going to be spent mostly on step 1, which is the gathering, the learning about the organization. And then once you start to absorb all of that information and the information about your community and the different funders, then you need to get everything set up as far as how you're going to organize yourself. And then in step 2, you start to use that information to zero in on the funders and begin to determine who you're going to ask. Once you make that match in your mind, put it on paper. It's important because when you go back and maybe 3 years from now you're seeking grants for certain organization or certain projects, and you already went to a funder for something and you don't remember that. So it's important to keep yourself organized and to keep information related to who you have asked and what their answer was. And if their answer was no, you don't fit into our geographical footprint, then that's never going to be a yes. But if your answer was no, right now we're not funding that type of program, then you know that you can go back. But if you don't have that documented, you don't want to call a funder a couple years later and have it be the same funder that you've called a few years ago and be talking to the same person and then be like, you know what, we already told you a couple years ago. So keep that in mind. Once you mail your proposal or your letter of inquiry, then you go into that step 4, which is communicating with the board, communicating with the funder. Like I said, wait a couple weeks and then call the funder, make sure they received it. And then finally, evaluate everything, make the revisions as necessary. And like I said, this can take sometimes a year or more. And when you have multiple grants, you have to stay organized. And taking the time in step 1 to ensure that you have everything set up properly is imperative. I can't tell you really how important that is. So like we said, grant seeking is about research and developing relationships. And many foundations think of the grant seeking process as the development of a marriage with the organization. And I always say, I would get a grant maybe in the amount of $3,000. And I would go to my boss, I'd say, look, it was an engagement ring. It's an engagement ring. Now we can go back to them and we can talk to them a little bit more and find out how we can get married to them. And that's really what grant seeking is. In many cases, it's meant to be a long-term partnership. And I'm saying many cases, it's not all cases. Some funders don't want a long-term partnership. They simply want to fund a good idea at the beginning. but most grant making organizations are themselves nonprofit organizations, and they have to pursue their mission and steward their resources responsibly. So their resources have to be allocated in a way that's going to maximize their impact in their community and their focus area. So as long as you're keeping that in mind when you're looking for grants, you should do really well. Worksheet 1.1, I'm going to send to everyone, and I'm not going to go over it. But if this is your first grant or your 30th grant, I always found the worksheet helpful because it defines the project in such a way that it makes you understand your project before you write for the grants. So we'll send that off to you as well. Then the next slide. Do a time check. Now you need to start identifying your priorities. So what are the essential pieces that you need to substantiate the need in the community? What data, statistics, and evidence do you have to support your priorities? So what's the unmet need in the community that you're going to address with your program? What's the problem area? And then how does this connect to your organization's mission? All grant seeking has to flow from and support your organization's mission. If the program doesn't support the organization's mission, you can't connect that. You can't connect those dots with the funder. So don't seek grants that are going to distract from your mission. And like I said, don't create programs just because there's money there to fund it. Find the grants that support your programs. Are there other organizations in the community already trying to fill that void? And if there are, how is what you're doing different? Or how can the two organizations collaborate to bring more money to the program? So think about the impact in the community and be able to answer the so what. You have to show that the organization is knowledgeable about the community need and that you have researched how to address the need. So you have to have statistics. And then how are you proving that the problem really exists? And we've run into this actually here at the Buhl Foundation, the Buhl Regional Health Foundation. We've been talking about, okay, here's a need, here's a need. Is it a perceived need or is it a real need? And if it's a real need, you should be able to find the data to support the need. And then you have to go beyond just kind of anecdotal evidence. Oh, I heard through the grapevine that this is a need. You have to talk to the authorities in the field, talk to the people that your project is going to benefit. You have to know the big picture about the trends related to your project, because guess what? The funders know. That's their forte. They're funding the programs that you're trying to write a grant for. So they know the data. So show them that you know the data. And then describe the present situation in your community, present that evidence, and then explain what should be happening. What could the community be like if that void is filled? And then step by step, you start to develop how you're going to address that need. And from that, you develop your goals and outcomes. And then you determine what methods are in place to help you determine your impact. So how are you going to move forward? And most importantly, how are you going to sustain the program? And if you can clearly identify those, then you can guarantee a good fit with the funder. So how do you find the funders? This is, if we could solve this problem, if our foundation could solve this problem, I would. But it's not easy to find the funders. A lot of networking, a lot of communications within the community, and you have to be out there. You have to participate in local, regional, national. If your program is something national, you have to be at those national networking opportunities. And then talk to previous funders. If you don't have any, look around the community and see if there's organizations doing similar work. And if there are, dig a little deeper and find out who their funders are. It's not wrong to go and find other organizations' funders if you're not duplicating that organization's programs. A lot of times funders want to see additional ways that they can support that community. And so don't feel like you're stepping on toes if you're going after funding from a funder that is also funding another organization in your area. Talk to your board. A lot of your board members might be employed by businesses that offer grants to organizations that their employees support. My husband works for Olympus America, and oftentimes if he makes a donation to an organization, they'll match it. And it's up to, I think it's up to like $3,000 or $5,000 on, during certain times of the year. And so, if you have a business that is willing to do that, that's $6,000 in your pocket. But if you don't ask your board members, you won't know. And then a lot of times board members will serve on foundations of boards, foundation boards in their community too. So that's one way to find the funders. On the next slide, I'm going to give you this slide, so don't worry, you don't have to write all these down. But these are some of the grant seeking, backup one, some of the grant seeking resources that I found helpful. And the very first one is the Foundation Centers, foundationcenter.org. And that organization, unfortunately, it's better served for you if you have a membership to it. And the membership is extremely expensive. At one time, our library had a membership to it, but I don't believe they do anymore. But at the very least, you can go on their website and get the basic information from it. So it's foundationcenter.org. And then there's foundationsearch.com also. Federal grants, keep in mind that if you're looking, grants.gov or federalregister.gov, you have to have a DUNS number first. And we'll talk a little bit later about what the DUNS number is. And then you have to register for the System for Award Management. And then you're allowed to search that SAM website and the grants.gov website. You can't just get on the federal websites and start searching. The hardest thing about the federal websites, and I used to do this when I worked for an environmental consulting firm, we were looking for grants related to stream restoration work. And if you're not searching exactly what you need to search, you're going to pull up thousands of grant opportunities, and it takes hours to dig through them. So sometimes a better way is to go through maybe the department, the federal department, for instance, maybe the Department of Education, if you're looking for education grants, or the Department of housing or whatever, if you're looking for those types of grants. And then state grant funding. Once you register with the state, you can search the Grants Gateway, and then you can go to individual state agencies. So that's another good way to search. As I said, the Foundation Center is the one that I always used. I want to say the membership was $3,500 a year, which seems like a lot, but I bet you I got probably $50,000 to $60,000 in grants by searching, through the Foundation Center. So there was a good payoff. They also link to so once you find a funder, there's a direct link to the funder's website, and then a link to the 990, which is what I'm going to teach you next, how to look at those 990s. Foundation Search America, I have not used that often. Candid isn't really a grant searching database as much as it offers training and videos. You can go there and get sample proposals, sample letters of inquiry, sample budgets. It's a great website for that. And then some of these others I've never used. The Grantsmanship Centers, TGCI, I have, and it has helpful information, workshops, seminars, publications, some free resources for grant writing. Keep in mind, though, the grant seeking process has become increasingly competitive over the last several years because there's more nonprofit organizations now, and everybody is searching. So sometimes it is worthwhile to spend the money to purchase, a grant seeking database. So we finally found a foundation, and we think that that foundation might work for us. How do you know that they're a match? I would always go to their website and look at their annual report if they publish one. Look within the annual report to find, at the very least, what are the categories that they're funding. Their annual report might talk about new initiatives, new funding areas, and it might give you an idea of how much funding is given to those different pies of focus areas. And then take your organization and your mind and fit it into one of those focus areas and see what is the size of the funding that's given to them. It's also going to give you more information to have about the funder when you make the call to them. But the best way to investigate your potential funder is to explore the 990. And so what we'll do over the next few slides is look at several different pieces of the 990 so that you know when you're looking at the 990 where to look. First of all, where do you find the 990s? Either it's linked from their website, oftentimes it's not though. GuideStar is the best way. You sign up for GuideStar, it's GUIDESTAR, and it's free. It's free, you can pull the 990 and look. There is also a membership that you can pay to belong, but you can pull up the 990s with the free version. So in your handouts, I include an article that was extremely beneficial to me when I very first started looking at 990s, and it's called something like 6 critical things to look for in the 990s. And it came from a grant writing blog that I belonged to a while back. But the first thing that you want to look for is what is the fiscal year for the foundation to which, or funder to which you're applying, and be strategic. So if their beginning of their tax year is January and they go to December, then you can kind of think that probably they're going to have a round of funding that goes sometime either within the first quarter or the first 6 months. If they award grants quarterly, then you want to know what those quarters are. And strategically, if this is an established foundation, you're going to want to submit your grant for that first round of funding of the year. And that's because you want to have that second round available for them to look at it if they don't fund it the first round. And number 2, if they're already established, then they may already have the programs in their mind that they're wanting to fund. But if they have a little bit of extra, for that first round, then you might fall in there. This is why that 5% payout is important. So if you're looking at a funder and their calendar year end is 12/31, and they have a 5% payout rule, they might not have paid out that 5% over their first 2 quarters or first 3 quarters. So strategically, if it's a newer foundation, you might want to submit your application closer to the end of that fiscal year, because if they're just starting to get into that 5% spend, they might need to spend money, and your application comes in and it's a great application. They may be looking to spend for something like that towards the end of the year. So just be strategic about when you're looking at the 990 and looking at what their calendar year is. On the next page, look at their assets and note the fair market value of all of their assets that are recorded, and then look back at previous 990s. And that's the nice thing about GuideStar, is you can literally click from one to the next to the next. I used to go back 3 years and look and see whether their assets are declining or they're growing. If they're declining, then it might give you an idea that the foundation is starting to spend down or maybe wind down their operations over the course of a couple years. If it's growing, then you know that this organization has additional money that they have to give every year. And so that's an organization where you might get your foot in the door early and get funding over and over again. But the revenue and expense summarizes this report and look and see, have they made major gifts during the year? And a couple of slides later, I'll show you how to look at that. But this part of the 990 is very important to you as a grant seeker. And then on the next page, it's that same part continued. This shows the total amount of gifts that they've given throughout the year. It doesn't give you the breakdown. We'll look at where they give you the breakdown, but that second red circle down at towards the bottom of the page, that's the total payout that they gave over the course of their year. And so keep in mind, this was what, 800 and some thousand, 875. If you're going to a foundation that gave a total payout of 875, you're not going to go to them with a $500,000 application. You would go to them with maybe a $15,000 to $20,000 application. If their contributions, gifts, grant paid is like 3 million, then you might be more likely to get a couple $100,000 grant from them. So that's why that section is important. And then also towards the top where I have the red circle, compensation of staff. Number one, this tells you that they have staff. And if they do have staff, that means there's somebody that you can contact. So, make sure that that you're looking at that. Look at the salaries and wages too. If they have a large staff and their salaries and wages are minimal, then that's probably a part-time staff. And then on the next page, part 8, this is one of the most important sections because this is going to give you the information that you need to know about everyone connected with that foundation. So you're going to find information about officers, directors, trustees, foundation managers, paid employees, sometimes contractors. Look through that, note the names, note the locations. When I was looking through a 990, at one point I was looking for our AED program. And I happened to glance through the officers and directors, and it was mostly a Pittsburgh organization, but there were 2 names on it that were from the Lawrence County and Mercer County area. And so I knew then that at the very least, there is a connection with our community in that funder. And that's important. When those people are sitting in meetings, then and they know their local organization, their local organizations and their community, and then they can say, well, yeah, this is a great program. It's something that is beneficial to our community. Also look here to the names and try to determine if this foundation is entirely family run, because usually organizations where you might see, I don't know, 5 of those names and they're all the same last name, then that that's a family run organization, and you maybe need to know an in to get in with that one. And then on the next slide, part 15 tells you how to prepare your application. Very rarely did I see that little checkbox checked where the funder does not receive applications from unsolicited organizations. But if that box is checked, don't even go any further. They've made up their mind about how they're spending their money, and you're not going to get in. But if that box isn't checked, then look down to that next section, and this is going to tell you how to prepare your application. And sometimes it'll, right where it says application form, sometimes it'll say grant makers of Western PA common form, or, something along that lines. It'll tell you, or, it might say letter of inquiry preferred. And then submission deadlines are usually there, and then who to call, who to mail to. I'm telling you right now, if there's a phone number there, call the person. Don't just blindly send an application in the mail. If there's no phone number there and you've done your research and you can't find a phone number, go ahead and blindly send something. But usually you want to try and make some sort of connection first. And then on the next page, part 15, is the summary of direct charitable activities. This, I think, was the most important part for me, because now you can scroll down through this list and you can look and see, okay, they gave $1,500 for sit-upon cushions. They gave $5,000 to replace bedding and material, $10,000 for food and clothing. I'm looking for whatever. And I think I could probably apply to them for $5,000. And there's a lot of strategery that goes on when you're looking at this section. I always look to see, okay, what was the highest amount that they awarded in 1 year to one single organization? And then I would look at the lowest amount. And then oftentimes with funders, they might have different, like Buhl Regional Health Foundation, we have different pillars. So in my mind, I would start to categorize those, grantees into the categories of their mission or their vision, and say, okay, well, these fall into housing or food and clothing. So my organization falls into that too. What's the range that they give? And then as an entry level organization, never ask for the full amount. Always go somewhere in the middle, just to get your foot in the door. You might also be able to find additional information on the funder's website. And like I said, through their annual reports. I always started with the 990s, and then I filled out that, the funder worksheet from the 990. And then once I determined whether or not I was a good match, then I would move on to, okay, let's look at their website. Let's look at their annual reports. Let's dig in a little bit deeper and find how we can match. But then there is no better place to start in my mind than the 990. So then on the next slide, the next thing we have to do is start to build the relationship. Like I said, a grant is a fair deal between an organization and a funder whose interests are similar, but whose resources are different. So your organization has the capability of doing the work. The funder has the money to use towards that goal. So your organization and its programs have a value that's equal to the grant money that you're asking for. To find the matches with those funders whose interests and goals are like yours. And then keep in mind that the funder's money does no good in the community unless it's invested in organizations that serve that community. So think of your program as an opportunity for the funder. And I can't express enough how important that is. You are not asking for money. You are an opportunity for them. So grants are often small and local, but sometimes they can be medium-sized and sometimes they'll come every year. But you should only approach a funder for a super grant or a huge, large grant or a multi-year grant after your organization has developed a relationship with that funder. Don't go into a funder with this grandiose idea that is going to be 5 years long and you want 500,000 or $1 million every year over the next 5 years for them. Start small, get your foot in the door, develop the relationship, and then go big. And then it's very important to touch your funders a few times throughout the year. And this is not just funders, but potential funders. I had one organization, they were in Alabama or somewhere in the South, and I never expected that they would send a check for the medical equipment recycling program, which is a program I was writing a grant for. But they had their mission and their vision fit so closely with what our program was doing that I felt it was worthwhile for me at the very least to reach out to them. And I talked to them and they said, well, yours sounds like a great program. Right now we're funding this program and we have 3 more across the country, but it will keep you in mind. So instead of just letting it go or saying, okay, well, I'll call them again next year, I started sending them my newsletter. And I sent them 4 newsletters over the course of a year. And then I reached back out to them after a year and I said, have you received my newsletters? What do you think of the program? Oh, yeah, you're a great program. You're right in line with, the different programs that we fund all over the country. But, we're still not quite sure. So I spent another year and I sent them the newsletter 4 more times over the course of the next year. And lo and behold, I touched base with them that second year and they were like, well, you know what, we have about, maybe a $5,000 growth that we might be able to send your way. Would that be helpful? I knew the organization like the back of my hand, and I was able to say to them, well, yes, you know what, right now we're in the middle of this project and we could use $5,000 to purchase parts for wheelchairs that, we haven't been able to refurbish. And well, that's wonderful. We'll send you the check. So that is how the relationship develops. It's the touches throughout the year. It's the keeping them informed of what you're doing and the good work you're doing and keeping that match in mind. This is what we're doing. This is what you're doing across the country or you're doing in another community. This is how those mesh together. And just keeping them informed every step of the way. Don't submit to a funder. Please don't submit to a funder if you don't meet all of their guidelines. That I think is probably one of the biggest pet peeves. They don't want, they're not going to change their ideas on who they fund because you have a wonderful idea. Like I said, they are stuck to fund what they're supposed to be funding. So just don't. If you're not sure though, pick up the phone or send an email. But then, like I said, make sure that you have the answers to those 6 questions while you're sitting there on that call. What community need does your program address? And as we're moving forward, that now becomes your needs statement in your grant application. And we're going to talk about that in the next class. What would an improved community situation look like? And this statement becomes the basis of forming your goals and objectives. What can your organization do to improve the situation? Now becomes your method section. How are you going to take the steps to get it done? And then how will the organization know if the program has succeeded? This is the evaluation section. And I can tell you that when I made the phone call to the funder, that was a question that they asked me. She said, well, how are you going to know if you've made a difference? How are you going to know that you succeeded if we send you this $5,000? And I'm telling you, had I not been ready with the answer to that question right then and there, they wouldn't have sent the $5,000 and we wouldn't have developed that relationship. The 5th thing is knowing how much it's all going to cost before you pick up the phone. And like I said, knowing how a small amount might be able to help you. And then how is your program going to be funded in the long run? And this becomes your sustainability. So be sure that your program has merit. And this is determined by the demonstrated community needs, strong leadership, and data to back it all up. And then I have 3 final tips for you before we start to answer some questions. The first is to picture the reader as being educated, but they have no clue about your organization. Okay, educated 8 to 12 grade level. All right, you don't want to be writing at such a high level that your average board member can't read it. Second is use compelling facts, not just facts. And this is so important. One time I was writing a grant, I was so excited that I found this data. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to throw that in the grant. And early on, it really didn't even support anything that I was asking for. But I was so excited to find data that I threw it in there. So make sure your facts support what you're asking for. Tell the compelling story. And then oftentimes funders will appreciate you putting a face or a situation to the facts. Sometimes they don't want the fluff, but sometimes they do want to see a face to what you're talking about. And then the third is always keep in mind that the grant is an investment on the part of the funder. And it's important to them that they make a meaningful investment within their community. So now, all of this that we went through today, it seems like it's such a waste of time to do all this planning when you don't even know if you're going to get the grant. Why can't you just figure it out once you win the grant? Well, it's because think of it as you're a builder and you're trying to build a house, but you don't have the blueprints. So your planning is the blueprints of your proposal. And without that, the funder is just simply not going to fund you. And like I said, if you don't have that information in front of you at your fingertips when you make that first connection, you may be leaving money behind that you could have gotten. And grant makers have to see exactly what you plan to do with their grant before they give you the money. They have to, because they're bound by law to give their money in a meaningful way. So that's why proposals generally start with this compelling, documented problem statement and measurable objectives. This is your blueprint to increasing the chance of having success for funding your program. So the next slide I'm putting up is just the references. This is where I have pulled everything. But I can tell you that the hands down best book on this slide, if you're going to invest in anything at all, invest in the only grant writing book you'll ever need. It's this, Karsh, Ellen, and Fox. This book, I think probably 90% of what we talked about in my master's program on grant writing came from this book. It was constantly referred to. The worksheets, I believe, came from the fourth one, which is the Winning Grants Step-by-Step, the complete workbook for planning, developing, and writing successful proposals. I would say that's probably the second best on this slide. So now we're going to turn off the recording. And then I'm going to open it up for, what I'll do is I'll have Jess, once we turn off the recording, I'll have you open up the chat and look at those questions first. And then we'll have everybody have the ability to unmute themselves. I just didn't want anyone, who wasn't comfortable asking questions during a recorded session, and I know it's